The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone realized Alessandro Romano had thrown it. Every conversation in the room died instantly. 50 of New York's most powerful people turned and stared at the man who had never, not once in 15 years, lost control in public. Alessandro didn't move. His jaw was locked. His eyes were fixed across the room on Sophia Bennett, who stood beside Daniel Carter, laughing at something the man had said. She hadn't even noticed the broken glass. That was the moment Alessandro understood exactly how dangerous his feelings had become. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because what happens next will shock you. Drop a comment and tell me what cities you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The charity auction had been Sophia's idea. Alessandro hadn't wanted to attend. He never wanted to attend events that required him to smile at people he didn't respect, while pretending to care about causes he could fund with the change in his coat pocket. But Sophia had stood in his office doorway 3 weeks earlier with a folder in her hand and a look on her face that meant the conversation was already over before it started. "The Children's Foundation Gala," she'd said, setting the folder on his desk without being invited. "February 14th, the Metropolitan Pavilion. You're going." "I have meetings. I rescheduled them. Sophia." Alessandro. She'd said his name the way she always said it when she thought he was being stubborn, without reason, not with irritation, not with fear, but with a kind of patient certainty that made him feel, somehow, like the less intelligent person in the room. 3 years ago, your company received a $20 million tax benefit because of your charitable contributions. The foundation's board includes 2 federal judges and a senator who sits on the finance committee. You being there matters. He'd looked at her for a long moment. She looked back without flinching. That was the thing about Sophia Bennett that no one else seemed to understand. Every other person in Alessandro's world, his lawyers, his accountants, his lieutenants, the men who had grown up in the same streets he had and built their power the same brutal way he had, every single one of them treated his silence like a threat. They watched his hands, they watched his eyes, they calculated the distance between themselves and the nearest exit. Sophia watched his face the way a person watches, whether curious, attentive, completely unafraid of what was coming. "Fine," he'd said. She'd picked up the folder and walked out without gloating. That was also a thing about her. The Metropolitan Pavilion on Valentine's Day was everything Alessandro despised about New York's upper-class crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's annual salary, a string quartet playing softly enough that no one actually listened, and 300 people moving through the room in careful, choreographed social portraits, each one calculating what every conversation was worth in connections, favors, and reputation. Alessandro moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the kind of stillness that made people step aside without being asked. He didn't chase conversation. People came to him. They always had. He was 41 years old and had been running the Romano organization since he was 26, when his father had a stroke at the dinner table, and Alessandro had stood up, looked around the room at the men who'd served his family for decades, and said, without raising his voice, "Nothing changes except who gives the orders." No one had questioned it. Not because of his last name, because of the way he said it, like he'd already decided how every possible argument would end and had simply chosen to skip ahead. That night at the gala, he stood near the north wall, holding a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking, watching the room with the professional patience of a man who understood that information gathered in a crowd was always worth more than information gathered at a table. He saw senators he'd donated to. He saw judges whose campaigns he'd quietly supported. He saw competitors watching him from across the room, smiling the way people smile when they're calculating whether to approach. And then he saw Sophia. She was standing near the auction display, a collection of donated artwork that Alessandro had already mentally catalogued and dismissed, and she was talking to a man he didn't immediately recognize. Tall, early 40s, dark suit, the kind of face that suggested someone who spent time outdoors and wasn't trying to hide it. The man was saying something, gesturing slightly with one hand, and Sophia was listening with her head tilted at an angle Alessandro knew well. That angle meant she was genuinely interested, not politely interested, not professionally interested, actually interested. Alessandro watched for approximately 30 seconds before he realized his hand had tightened on the glass. He made himself relax his grip. He turned to Marcus, who stood 2 steps to his left, one of 3 men who moved with Alessandro through public events as a matter of operational habit. "Who is that?" Marcus glanced over without making it obvious. "Daniel Carter, Tech and Philanthropy. Sold his software company about 4 years ago for somewhere around 800 million. Since then, he's been running a nonprofit infrastructure, job training, community development, some international education programs. Clean, no criminal record, no civil suits, no significant debt. He's been on the foundation's board for 2 years." Alessandro looked back across the room. Daniel Carter was now saying something that made Sophia laugh. Not her professional laugh, the polished, controlled one she used in meetings when someone made a joke that wasn't quite funny but required acknowledgement. This was the real one, the one that made her eyes close slightly at the corners and her whole face change for just a second before she recovered her composure. Alessandro had heard that laugh maybe a dozen times in 3 years. He could count each instance. He put his glass down on the nearest surface and walked across the room. "Mr. Romano." Sophia saw him coming. She always saw him coming, some perceptual awareness he'd never entirely understood, as though she registered the change in the room's energy before she registered him specifically. "Sophia." He stopped beside her and looked at Daniel Carter with the kind of measured, flat attention that most people interpreted as courtesy and experienced people recognized as assessment. "I don't think we've been introduced." Daniel Carter extended his hand without hesitation. "Daniel Carter, I've heard a lot about you. I hope it was interesting." "Some of it." Carter smiled. It was a direct smile, not ingratiating, not cautious, just a natural expression on a face that seemed comfortable with itself. "I was just telling your assistant about our job placement program. We've had some success in communities with high economic displacement, working with local businesses to create apprenticeships that actually lead to sustainable employment rather than just temporary work. He's placed over 3,000 people in permanent jobs in the last 18 months, Sophia said. She was looking at Carter with that attentive expression again, and something in Alessandro's chest tightened without permission. "And the retention rate at 24 months is 68%, which is minus..." "Remarkable," Alessandro said. His voice came out perfectly level. He was professionally proud of that. "You've done your research." "Daniel mentioned it, and I looked it up," Sophia said simply. She didn't add anything defensive or explanatory because she never felt the need to justify her own curiosity. "She's thorough," Carter said, with an appreciation in his voice that Alessandro found completely disproportionate to the length of the acquaintance. "That's rare." "Yes," Alessandro said, "it is." A pause opened between the three of them, the specific kind of pause that arises when two people are having a visible conversation and an invisible one simultaneously. Sophia looked at Alessandro with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, which was unusual. He could generally categorize her expressions with precision. "Are you enjoying the evening?" she asked him. "I'm finding it educational." "Good." She turned back to Carter, which Alessandro noted with a specific awareness. "You were saying about the community partnership model, minus." "Would you excuse us?" Alessandro said. Sophia stopped. Carter looked at Alessandro with a kind of easy, unperturbed attention. "Of course." Sophia looked at Alessandro the way she looked at him when she was deciding whether something he'd done was worth addressing now or later. Then she smiled at Carter genuinely, warmly, the way she almost never smiled in Alessandro's professional sphere, and said, "Excuse me a moment." She followed Alessandro 3 steps away, which was as far as he went. "That was rude," she said quietly, without inflection. "I need you for something." "What?" He looked around the room. He had absolutely nothing he needed her for. Sophia watched his eyes do that, and her expression shifted not to anger, but to something more careful and more attentive. The way it shifted when she was processing something she hadn't expected. "Alessandro," she said slowly, "what is it you actually need?" "The senator from Connecticut is here. I wanted to..." "Senator Walsh left 20 minutes ago. I watched him leave." She paused. "I watch everyone in rooms you're in. It's part of my job." Another pause. "Queter, what's actually happening?" He looked at her directly. For one moment, just one, the length of a breath, he almost said it. Then his internal architecture reasserted itself, the one he'd been building since he was 16 years old, and had understood that what you feel and what you show are two separate instruments that a man in his position cannot afford to confuse. "Nothing," he said. "Go back to your conversation." She studied him for 2 more seconds. Then she went back to Daniel Carter. Alessandro retrieved his scotch and drank half of it. The next 40 minutes were professionally excruciating. Alessandro Romano had survived negotiations with men who wanted him destroyed. He had sat across tables from federal prosecutors with enough evidence to end his freedom and held his expression steady and spoken in complete sentences. He had stood at his father's grave in the rain and said a speech that every man present later described as remarkable for its composure. He was not composed. He was standing 11 feet away from Sophia Bennett and Daniel Carter, talking to a financial consultant whose name he had already forgotten, and he was tracking every shift in Sophia's body language with the obsessive precision of a man who understood for the first time that he had been cataloging her for 3 years without ever admitting what the catalog was for. The way she stood when she was genuinely engaged, weight slightly forward, shoulders open, that tilt of the head. The way she used her hands when she was making a point she cared about, a specific small gesture with 3 fingers. The way she laughed, that real laugh, the one she almost never showed, and how it changed her face for one unguarded second before she pulled it back under control. He knew all of it. He'd been watching all of it for 3 years. He'd been telling himself it was professional attention, the way any intelligent man pays attention to the people in his environment who are most useful, most reliable, most worth understanding. The financial consultant said something. Alessandro said, which was apparently appropriate because the man continued talking. Sophia touched Carter's arm for a brief second, an emphasis to something she was saying, and Alessandro felt something move through his chest that wasn't anger, exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. He excused himself from the financial consultant. He crossed the room. "Daniel," he said, arriving at Carter's side with a friendliness he constructed from raw professional material, "there are some people here I think you should meet. Jackson Wentworth, have you two been introduced? He runs the Wentworth Family Foundation. I think your programs would interest him considerably." Carter looked at him with an expression that was pleasant and not entirely readable. "That's generous of you." "Sure." Alessandro looked at Sophia. "I'll send him back in a moment." He walked Carter away from her before either of them had time to respond. It took him 14 minutes to deposit Carter with Jackson Wentworth, who, Alessandro acknowledged privately, was genuinely interested in Carter's programs and whose engagement was therefore not entirely manufactured. When he returned to the spot where he'd left Sophia, she wasn't there. He found her at the coat check. "Are you leaving?" he asked. "I have an early morning. The event runs until 11. "I know when it runs until." She accepted her coat from the attendant and looked at Alessandro with an expression he'd seen before, the one she wore when she'd made a decision and was waiting to see if he was going to make it difficult. "You navigated me away from that conversation 3 times tonight." "I had." "Don't." She said it quietly but completely, the way you stop a sentence that doesn't have a good ending. "Don't explain it as business. You've never done that before. You've introduced me to people. You've sent me to manage conversations. You've pulled me away when something required attention." She paused. "This was different, and I think you know that." He looked at her in the dimmer light of the coat check alcove. She looked back. "He's a good man," she said, and her voice had lost its professional edge just slightly, just enough to sound like a person talking to another person instead of an employee talking to an employer. "And I'm allowed to find that interesting. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Alessandro said. "Do you?" she asked, and it wasn't unkind. He didn't answer. Sophia put on her coat, straightened the collar with 2 efficient movements, and looked at him one more time. "Good night, Alessandro." She left. Alessandro stood at the coat check for an amount of time he later couldn't account for, holding his own coat in one hand, looking at the door through which she'd walked. Marcus appeared at his shoulder. "Car? In a minute." Marcus waited. "Who is Daniel Carter's security team?" Alessandro asked. "Private, 3-man rotation, standard corporate executive protection, nothing unusual." Background on his current projects. "All of them. I want it tomorrow morning." Marcus didn't ask why. That was Marcus's most useful quality. The file arrived at 7:45 the next morning. Alessandro was already at his desk, had been since 6, which was not unusual, but the reading he was doing was unusual, a habit he'd developed in the past 8 hours of lying awake and then giving up on sleep and going to his study and reading. Not the financial reports he typically read before 7, but the public record on Daniel Carter. He didn't examine what that meant. The physical file from Marcus was more comprehensive. Alessandro read it carefully, the way he read everything methodically, without skipping, absorbing the information as architecture rather than individual facts. Daniel Carter, 43, born in Baltimore. Father was a construction worker. Mother was a high school science teacher. He'd gotten a scholarship to Johns Hopkins, graduated with a double major in computer science and economics. Built a software company in his late 20s that solved a specific logistics problem in supply chain management and sold it at 39 for $820 million. No criminal record, no significant civil litigation. 2 speeding tickets, one in 2019, one in 2021. Divorced once 7 years ago amicably, his ex-wife was now on the board of his foundation. The divorce settlement had been straightforward, no dispute. He had a 10-year-old daughter who lived primarily with her mother in Philadelphia and visited him on alternating weekends and school holidays. His foundation, the Carter Community Initiative, was legitimate. Not a tax vehicle, not a vanity project. It had a staff of 47 people, an annual operating budget of $12 million, most of which came from his own capital, and a program effectiveness record that had been independently audited twice and held up both times. He lived in a 4-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side. He owned no yacht, no second home, no aircraft. He drove a 4-year-old Volvo. He was, in every measurable sense, exactly what he appeared to be. Alessandro put the file down. He had spent 15 years in a world where almost nothing was exactly what it appeared to be. He had developed instincts for the hidden mechanism, the concealed interest, the manufactured surface, the gap between what a man showed and what a man was. Daniel Carter appeared to have no gap. Alessandro didn't know what to do with that. What he did know, and this arrived with the clarity that occasionally came at 7:45 in the morning when he hadn't slept and the city light was still thin through the windows, was that his behavior the previous evening had been driven by something he hadn't examined and needed to examine. He picked up his phone, he put it down, he got up from his desk, walked to the window, and looked at the city. He thought about Sophia standing at the coat check saying, "He's a good man, and I'm allowed to find that interesting." He thought about the fact that she'd said it without anger. That was important. Sophia Bennett in actual anger was precise and contained the way dangerous things are when they're controlled. What she'd shown the previous night wasn't anger, it was something closer to sadness. Like she'd been waiting for him to show something, and when he showed the wrong thing, the waiting became exhaustion. Alessandro had never wanted to exhaust her. He'd never thought about it directly in those terms, but standing at the window with the file on his desk and the memory of the previous evening turning over in his mind like a problem that refused to resolve, he understood that he'd spent 3 years making a very careful series of choices designed to keep Sophia in his life without ever having to acknowledge what that meant. He'd made her indispensable professionally. He'd relied on her judgment, her intelligence, her ability to read rooms and people and situations with a precision that matched his own. He'd structured his days around her presence without ever calling it that. And then he'd watched another man notice her in the span of a single evening and felt something come apart in his chest that he had no name for and no protocol to address. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Sophia. He answered immediately, which he noted with the specific self-awareness that had developed overnight of a man who'd stopped lying to himself about certain things. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." Her voice was its normal self-professional, brisk, oriented to purpose. "I'm downstairs. We have the Mercer Group call at 9, and I need to brief you on 3 things before then." "Can I come up?" Yes. She came up. She walked in with a leather portfolio and a coffee in each hand, his black, which she set on his desk without being asked, the way she'd been doing for 2.5 years, and she didn't mention the previous evening. Neither did he. They went through the 3 briefing items: a contract amendment the Mercer Group had requested, a scheduling conflict in the 3rd week of February that required resolution, and a personnel issue in the Chicago office that needed his decision before end of day. He made the decisions. She noted them. She was about to close her portfolio and stand when he said, "Sophia." She looked at him. He had no plan for what came after her name. He'd said it on instinct, and now he was sitting at his desk, looking at the woman who had just spent 40 minutes efficiently solving 3 problems, who held her coffee cup with both hands when she wasn't writing, who had a small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd once mentioned came from a childhood bicycle accident, and that he had never once asked more about, and he had absolutely no idea how to cross the distance between what he was and what the moment required. "About last night," he said. She waited. "Carter's programs are genuine," he said. "I had him reviewed. His foundation's outcomes are independently verified. He's not a threat to any of our operational interests." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think he was," she said carefully. "Is that what you were concerned about?" Alessandro looked at her. She looked at him. The space between them was very quiet. "I'll let you know when the Mercer call connects," she said. She went back to her office. Alessandro sat at his desk. He thought about the way she'd said, "Is that what you were concerned about?" The emphasis so light it was almost nothing, but not nothing. He thought about the fact that Sophia Bennett, who understood him better than any person alive, had asked him that question, and then given him the exit before he had to answer it. He thought that might be the kindest thing anyone had ever done for him. And it made everything worse. 3 days later, Alessandro's information network, the one that operated parallel to his legitimate business interests, the one that had kept him ahead of every significant threat for 15 years, delivered something unexpected. One of his analysts flagged a connection. Daniel Carter's foundation had been making significant inroads into communities in South Brooklyn and the Bronx, the same communities that 2 of Alessandro's competitors, men he'd spent a decade carefully managing through a combination of strategy and territorial respect, had been using as financial infrastructure. Not illegal, exactly, or not provably, the arrangement existed in the specific legal gray area that intelligent organized crime had always occupied. What Carter's programs were doing by creating legitimate employment, by building community trust in institutions, by raising the economic expectations of entire neighborhoods was, whether Carter understood it or not, disrupting the dependency structures that made those communities useful to Alessandro's rivals. The rival organization had noticed. Alessandro's analyst included a memo cautiously worded, because the analysts always worded things cautiously, suggesting that Daniel Carter might be approaching a threshold where certain people would consider him a problem that required a solution. Alessandro read the memo twice. He held it in his hands for a long moment. Then he made 4 phone calls. The first was to his head of security operations. The second was to a man in the Brooklyn District Attorney's office. The third was to a federal contact who operated in a space Alessandro never discussed publicly. The fourth was to Marcus. "Carter needs coverage," he said. "Discreet. Doesn't need to know about it. I want eyes on anything moving in his direction." Marcus asked no questions. Alessandro put the phone down. He sat back in his chair. He examined carefully what he had just done. He had just assigned protective resources to a man he had been jealous of 72 hours earlier. He had done it because the man was in danger he didn't know about and didn't deserve. He had done it because the alternative, allowing something to happen to Daniel Carter, because Alessandro had let pride and territory and wounded feeling override the straightforward moral reality, was not something he was willing to be. But he had also done it, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge this, because Sophia cared about Carter's work. Because if something happened to Daniel Carter, Sophia would be devastated. And the thought of her devastation was something he could not allow. He wasn't sure what that meant about him. He was beginning to suspect it meant everything. He was reviewing the security arrangements for Carter's foundation offices, a meeting he'd scheduled under a legitimately named property management company that shared real estate interests with the Carter Initiative. Building when Sophia knocked on his office door. "Your 3:30 was moved to 4, she said from the doorway. "Thank you." She started to leave. "Sophia." She stopped. He looked at the papers on his desk, then at her. "Do you know much about Carter's work, outside of what you looked up at the gala?" She turned back to him fully. Her expression was careful. "Some. Why?" His programs are drawing attention from people who don't want them to succeed. He said it plainly, directly, the way he always said things that mattered without theater. Not public criticism, the other kind. She was quiet for a moment. How serious? Serious enough that I've made arrangements. She stared at him. You made arrangements to protect Daniel Carter? His work, yes, and him, Alessandro. Her voice had changed. Why? Because he's doing something that matters, and he's doing it in a neighborhood where certain people don't want things to improve. And because letting him walk into something without knowing about it would be wrong. He paused. It's straightforward. She was quiet for longer this time. When she spoke, her voice had something in it he couldn't name. Did you do this because of me? I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's not a no. He met her eyes. No, he said. It's not. Sophia held his gaze for a moment. Then she said very quietly, thank you. She left. Alessandro looked at the papers on his desk. His hands, he noticed, were perfectly still. That was unusual. Usually when he was in the middle of something complicated and unresolved and emotionally significant, his hands had a slight tension to them, not a tremor, nothing visible, but a readiness that came from decades of inhabiting a world where physical tension was sometimes the only warning you got. But they were still. He thought about why. He thought it might be because for the first time in 3 days, he had done something that didn't require him to pretend his reasons were different from what they actually were. He had told her a true thing, and she had said thank you. And that, Alessandro Romano thought, looking at his still hands, was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. He didn't sleep well again that night. But this time, it wasn't the agitation of the coat-check alcove and the thin, unfamiliar feeling of watching another man make Sophia laugh. It was something quieter. He lay in the dark and thought about the fact that he was 41 years old and had spent his entire life building things and controlling things and protecting things, and that the one thing he had never built, never controlled, never thought about protecting was the thing that apparently mattered most. Not the empire, not the reputation, not the carefully maintained balance of fear and respect and calculated relationship that made his world function. The woman who had walked into his orbit 3 years ago looked directly at him and refused to be impressed. He had no protocol for this. He had protocols for everything else. For hostile takeovers and federal investigations and rivals who wanted him destroyed and partners who wanted to manipulate him. He had no protocol for the specific and unprecedented situation of having been looking at Sophia Bennett for 3 years and only understanding now, at 41, in the dark, that what he'd been looking at the whole time was the person he was most afraid to lose. And she didn't belong to him, had never belonged to him, had never once given him reason to believe she would accept belonging to anyone. That was, Alessandro thought, the specific and complicated truth of it. He admired her for the very quality that made his position impossible. He closed his eyes. He thought, with the uncharacteristic clarity of a man who has finally stopped arguing with himself, I need to figure out what I'm willing to do about this. Not what he could control, not what he could manage. What he was willing to do. He didn't have an answer yet. But asking the right question was, he'd always believed, the beginning of everything. He let himself hold that, and eventually, just before 4 in the morning, he slept. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, 4 days after the gala. Alessandro was already at his desk. He hadn't gone back to bed after 4 o'clock had tried, briefly, and given up, and come to his study instead, and sat with coffee and the specific, uncomfortable awareness of a man who has stopped arguing with himself about something, and now has to figure out what to do next. He saw Sophia's name on the screen. He answered on the first ring. There's a problem, she said. No greeting. She only skipped greetings when something was actually wrong. Daniel Carter's office called me 20 minutes ago. His program director in the Bronx, a woman named Maricela Torres, she was followed home last night. 2 men. They didn't approach her, didn't say anything. Just followed. She knows what it means. Alessandro was already standing. Is she safe? She's home. She's scared. Who called you? Daniel, a brief pause. He has my card from the gala. He said he didn't know who else to call, and that you'd mentioned you had he used the word resources. Alessandro processed this quickly. Carter had called Sophia. Carter had Sophia's card. Carter had described him as having resources, which was either extremely perceptive or a politely indirect way of saying something more specific. "Give me the address," Alessandro said. Alessandro. Sofia. The address. She gave it to him. He had 2 men at Maricela Torres's building in the South Bronx within 35 minutes. Not visible men, not the kind that stood on corners and made a statement. The quiet kind. The kind Alessandro used when the point was protection rather than demonstration. He texted Marcus. Torres' situation contained for now. "I need full background on who's been watching Carter's Bronx operation." Today, Marcus responded with a single word: moving. Alessandro put the phone down and looked at the window. Carter had called Sofia, not his own security team. Not the police, not any of the attorneys or connected people that a man of his wealth would have access to. He had called Sofia, and Sofia had called Alessandro. He didn't know exactly what to do with that chain of events. But he filed it carefully, the way he filed everything that mattered, in the part of his mind where significant information lived, until he understood it well enough to act on it. By 9 o'clock he was in his office. By 9:15, Sofia was standing across the desk from him, and Daniel Carter was standing beside her. Alessandro looked at Carter for a moment before speaking. Carter looked back, same as he had at the gala, that easy, unperturbed attention that Alessandro had found irritating the first time, and found, upon second examination, to be something else entirely. It was the attention of a man who had nothing to hide and therefore nothing to perform. "Thank you for seeing me," Carter said. "Sit down," Alessandro said. They both sat. Sofia took her usual chair, the one slightly to the left, and angled toward the desk, the position she always occupied in meetings, from which she could see both Alessandro and whoever he was talking to. 3 years of watching her occupy that position. It was so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. He noticed it now. He moved his attention back to Carter. "Tell me what you know about who's been watching your operation." Carter leaned forward slightly. "For about 3 weeks, I've been getting reports from community members, people who work with us, who trust us enough to tell me things. Men they don't recognize showing up near our program sites. A car parked outside Maricela's building twice before last night. One of our job placement counselors said someone asked him questions about our funding sources and our operational structure." He paused. "I'm not naive about what that means." "You're not," Alessandro agreed. "How much do you know about the economic structure of the communities your programs are working in?" "Enough to understand that certain parties benefit from keeping them economically vulnerable." Carter's voice was steady. No theater in it, no outraged performance. Just a person who had thought about something clearly and arrived at a clear place. "I understand that what we're doing disrupts arrangements that have existed for a long time. I understood that going in. I didn't fully anticipate the pace at which someone would decide we were worth responding to." "You moved faster than they expected," Alessandro said. 68% retention at 24 months. Those aren't program statistics. Those are community statistics. Those are people who don't need the arrangement anymore. He looked at Carter directly. "That's the threat, not to the money, to the dependency." Carter looked at him for a moment with an expression that Alessandro couldn't entirely read. "You understand this very specifically. I understand the neighborhoods you're working in." "Yes," Carter said quietly. "I imagine you do." Another pause. "The specific kind, 2 men on opposite sides of an unstated reality, neither pretending it isn't there." "What do you need?" Alessandro said. "I need Maricela safe. I need my staff safe. And I need to keep operating, because the moment I pull back, everyone in those communities understands what it means when something good gets pushed out." Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "I won't do that to them." Alessandro looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Sofia. She was watching him with an expression he'd been cataloging for days now, the one he hadn't been able to categorize at the coat check. He could categorize it now. It was the expression of a person who is watching someone they care about make a decision that will tell them something important about who that person actually is. He looked back at Carter. "I'll handle the security situation," he said. "Maricela and your key staff members will have protection they won't see, but that will be real. The parties responsible for the surveillance will understand, through channels that don't require anyone to say anything directly, that your operation is under protection." Carter was quiet. Why? Because your work is legitimate, and your people are being threatened for doing legitimate work. That's not a complete answer. Alessandro held his gaze. No, it isn't. He paused. But it's a true one. Sometimes the complete answer isn't the relevant one. Carter looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, not quickly, not easily, but with the weight of a person who has decided to accept a thing they can't fully resolve. All right, I'll need your full staff roster and the location of every program site. Marcus will contact your office this afternoon. Carter stood. He extended his hand. Alessandro shook it. Carter's grip was firm and direct, the way his attention was. I'm going to say something that might be inappropriate, Carter said, still holding the handshake. Go ahead. You're not what I expected. Alessandro let the handshake end. People say that. I mean it as a genuine observation, not a compliment. I know, Alessandro said. I took it that way. Carter almost smiled. He looked at Sophia. Thank you, Sophia, for everything. He said her name warmly, easily, the way a person says the name of someone they respect and are grateful to. And Alessandro noted his own internal reaction to that with the clinical precision of a man who has decided to stop pretending his reactions don't exist. He felt it. He didn't act on it. Those were two different things. Carter left. The office was quiet. Sophia didn't move from her chair for a moment. Then she looked at Alessandro. That was remarkable, she said. It was practical. It was also remarkable. She paused. You didn't have to do that. Someone needed to. Alessandro. She said his name the way she had at the gala, that specific weighted patience, the sound of someone who is asking a real question and waiting for a real answer. You don't like him. He looked at her. That's not accurate, he said carefully. You liked him less 4 days ago than you do this morning. He was quiet for a moment. He's a good man, Alessandro said finally. You were right about that. Sophia absorbed this. He could see her absorbing it, the slight shift in her posture, the brief stillness of a person processing something unexpected. You're telling me I was right. You usually are. You don't usually say so. I'm saying so now. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not easily read, not simple, the layered expression of a person who is feeling several things at once and has the intelligence and self-discipline not to collapse them into a single reaction. I'll get Marcus on the Carter roster, she said. She stood and walked to the door. Sophia, she turned. I'm sorry, he said, for the gala. For maneuvering you away from that conversation. He paused. He was not a man who apologized frequently. He was trying to do it well. It was not what I told you it was. She was quiet. I know, she said. She left. Marcus came back with the full picture by 2 in the afternoon, and it was worse than Alessandro had expected. The men watching Carter's Bronx operation weren't freelancers. They were connected to Victor Sorin, a name Alessandro knew well, a man who had spent the better part of a decade building influence in exactly the neighborhoods Carter's programs were now disrupting. Sorin was careful, methodical, and not known for hesitation. He was also, Alessandro noted, increasingly willing in recent years to take actions that created exposure risk, a sign of a man who has started to feel pressure from multiple directions and has become less patient. Marcus laid it out without editorializing. That was Marcus's gift. He presented information the way a doctor presents imaging results. Here is what it shows. Here is what it means. Here is what the range of outcomes looks like. What it showed was that Sorin had already made a decision. The surveillance of Maricela Torres was not a warning shot. It was reconnaissance. He was mapping Carter's people before taking a next step. Alessandro had perhaps 2 weeks before that step arrived. What level of engagement? Marcus asked. The word goes out to Sorin that Carter's under our umbrella. There are 2 possibilities. He backs off, or he decides to find out whether we mean it. He'll back off, Alessandro said. You're confident? Sorin is practical when his interests are clear. His interest right now is expanding east, not creating a conflict with me. The Carter operation is a nuisance to him, not a priority. If the cost of continuing increases, he'll find a different approach. Alessandro paused. But I want the word delivered personally, not through intermediaries. I'll call Dmitri. Marcus nodded. Dmitri was the person through whom Alessandro and Sorin's organization communicated in situations that needed clarity without documentation. One more thing, Marcus said. Carter's been contacted by someone in the federal system. An investigator named Reeves, out of the Southern District. They've been talking for about 6 weeks. Alessandro went still. About what? Corruption in community development contracting. The specific contracts that Soren's organization has been using as financial infrastructure in those neighborhoods. Marcus looked at him steadily. Carter's been providing information. Voluntarily. He's been building a case. Alessandro sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Daniel Carter, the man he'd navigated away from Sofia at a charity gala because he was jealous of the way she laughed at his stories, was quietly, methodically, without fanfare, helping to build a federal case against the people who had been threatening his staff. Alessandro thought about what kind of man does that. What kind of man looks at a situation that is dangerous and complicated and that he could walk away from with his $800 million and his Volvo and his daughter in Philadelphia and chooses to stay in it? The same kind of man who hires 47 people to run programs that create jobs in communities that other people have given up on. The same kind of man who calls the right person when his staff is being threatened instead of pretending the problem isn't there. He's building something, Alessandro said, half to himself. He is, Marcus agreed. Alessandro picked up his phone and called Dimitri. The conversation was brief, and in a language Alessandro had learned from his grandmother before he learned English, and that he only used when he wanted absolute precision. It took 4 minutes. When it was over, he had Dimitri's confirmation that the message would reach Soren by end of day. He put the phone down. He thought about Carter sitting across from him that morning saying, "I won't do that to them." He thought about what it cost, in Alessandro's world, to say something that simple and that absolute, and mean it without calculation. He thought it cost more than most people understood. He was in a conference call at 4 o'clock when his assistant, not Sophia, his secondary office assistant, a young man named Tom who handled scheduling and logistics, knocked and said, "Miss Bennett says it's urgent." Alessandro excused himself from the call. Sophia appeared in the doorway with her phone in her hand and an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she'd received information that required immediate assessment and response. "Maricela Torres called me directly," Sophia said. "A man approached her outside her building an hour ago. Not following her approach, gave her a name, told her to pass it to Carter. The name was Victor Soren." Alessandro felt something cold move through him. "He's escalating. Maricela doesn't know what the name means." "Carter will. I called Carter already. He's with the federal investigator Reeves. He said Soren's name in a federal context. Is she stopped?" "Alessandro, this has become something much larger than Carter's programs." "I know. If Soren is making direct contact with Carter's people now, that means he knows Carter is talking to the federal investigators." Alessandro was already moving, retrieving his jacket from the chair behind his desk. "Which means someone told him. Which means Carter has an information problem somewhere in his organization." Sophia's eyes went sharp. Someone on his staff is talking to Soren. Or was until recently. The timing of the approach, direct contact, Soren's name, right now that's not pressure. That's displacement. He's moving because something changed, and he's reacting faster than he planned to. Alessandro buttoned his jacket. The federal case is moving faster than Soren expected. "What do you need from me?" He looked at her. For one moment he thought about saying the real answer to that question, the honest, complete answer that had been accumulating for 3 years and had taken a charity gala and 4 sleepless days to arrive at the surface. Instead he said, "I need you to get Carter on the phone and tell him he cannot go home tonight. I need an address. I have a safe property in Midtown. Carter can be there within the hour if he leaves now. And Maricela needs to move tonight as well. I'll handle it." She was already dialing. He watched her, the speed of her, the efficiency of her, the way she moved through crisis, the way some people move through water, without thrashing, with economy. He had watched her do this for 3 years. He had told himself every time that it was professional admiration. The objective appreciation of a competent person for someone whose competence matched his own in a different domain. Standing in his office at 4:17 in the afternoon, watching her manage a federal protection situation with the same calm she used to reschedule his meetings, he stopped telling himself that. She looked up from the phone. "Carter's moving. Maricela is resistant. She's scared of appearing afraid. Yes. Tell her this isn't about appearance. Tell her the smartest people Alessandro Romano knows are the ones who make the right call when the information is clear." And the information is clear. Sophia looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she relayed it, not word for word, her own version, better and more direct than his. Maricela agreed. She's moving in 20 minutes, Sophia said. Good. What are you going to do? I'm going to call someone who owes me a significant favor and whose position makes certain things possible in this situation that wouldn't be possible otherwise. He picked up the phone. And I'm going to make sure that by tomorrow morning, Victor Sorin understands that the calculation he's been making for the past 3 weeks has been based on incomplete information. Sophia was quiet for a moment. This is dangerous. Yes, for you. He looked at her. Sophia, I've been navigating dangerous situations for 20 years. I'm still here. That's not reassuring. That's statistic. He almost smiled. Go home. I'll handle this. I'm not going home. Sophia, I'm not. She said it with the specific flat certainty that told him the conversation was already over. Carter is in a safe property that I helped arrange. Maricela is moving because I made the call. Whatever you're doing tonight, I'm not sitting in my apartment reading about it afterward. She held his gaze. I'm your assistant. That's the whole job. He looked at her. He thought about telling her the job description did not include this. He thought about the fact that she would look at him with complete equanimity and tell him he was wrong. He thought about the fact that she would be right. Fine, he said. But you do what I tell you. I do what I tell myself, she said, and it usually aligns. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that Alessandro had done many times in his career, and that never, in his experience, became routine. It was the work of managing moving pieces under pressure, the federal contact, who needed to understand the timeline without understanding everything Alessandro knew about how he knew it. The Dimitri call that needed to be escalated, a second conversation more specific than the first. The coordination of security at the Midtown property, where Carter was now installed, working from a laptop and refusing, by all accounts, to stop working. The delicate problem of the information source inside Carter's organization, which Alessandro had already identified a logistics coordinator who had taken on debt 18 months ago and had been managing it the only way he'd found available. That situation Alessandro handled through a third-party arrangement that he didn't explain to anyone except Marcus, and that resulted, by 9:30 that night, in the coordinator's debt being purchased and his connection to Sorin's network becoming unnecessary and therefore over. He didn't tell Carter about this. Some things worked better when the only person who knew how they worked was the person who made them work. Sophia sat in the chair across from his desk and did what she always did during complex operational periods. She managed the information flow. Calls came in, she filtered them, questions came up. She answered the ones she could and flagged the ones she couldn't. She ordered food at 7, which Alessandro ate without noticing, and coffee at 9, which he noticed because she brought it to his desk instead of leaving it at the edge, and their hands came close enough that he could feel the warmth of the cup between them. At 10:15, Marcus called. Sorin had received the message. He was standing down. Alessandro relayed this to Marcus, told him he would expect a full situation report in the morning, and ended the call. He sat back. The office was quiet in the specific way an office gets quiet after hours, the building's ambient sound on, the street noise muted by distance. Sophia was looking at him. It's handled, he said. She let out a slow breath, not theatrical, the real kind, the kind that comes when a person has been holding tension they didn't fully acknowledge and the holding is over. Carter, he's safe. His people are safe. Sorin won't move on the program again. What did you do? Several things I'll explain more specifically when it's not. He looked at the time, 10:17 at night. She looked at him for a long moment. You spent the last 6 hours protecting a man you met 4 days ago. I spent the last 6 hours protecting people who deserve to be protected. Alessandro. He looked at her. Why, she said, and it was the same question Carter had asked that morning. But in Sophia's voice it was different. Smaller and larger at the same time, not asking about strategy. Asking about the real thing underneath the strategy. He was tired. Not physically, he could function on 3 hours of sleep without significant degradation, had done so regularly for 20 years. But tired in the way that comes after a long period of carrying something and pretending the weight isn't there. Because he matters to you, Alessandro said. Not like that. He stopped, gathered himself, the way he gathered himself before every sentence that mattered. Because the work matters to you, because you looked at what he's doing and you saw something real. And you don't, he paused again, you don't find things real easily. It takes something genuine to get that look on your face. The one you had at the gala. Sophia was very still. I was jealous, Alessandro said, at the gala. You asked me if I understood that you're allowed to find something interesting. I said yes, but I didn't. I was telling you what I should feel, not what I felt. He held her gaze. I felt something else, and the way I acted on it was wrong. Not because I didn't have the right to feel it, but because what I felt was not a right. It was just a feeling, and you are not someone I have any claim on. The silence that followed was the longest silence he could remember between them. He watched her process it, the small, careful movements of her face, the way her hands were still in her lap, the quality of her attention. How long, she asked. The words were quiet, not accusatory. Just asking the real question. He thought about answering carefully. Then he thought about the fact that he'd been answering carefully for 3 years, and where that had gotten him. Long enough, he said, that I know which laugh is real. Sophia looked at him. He looked back. The moment was what it was, not a resolution, not a declaration, not the beginning of something clean and clear. Just two people in a quiet office at 10:17 at night, on the other side of a complicated day, looking at each other with the specific attention of people who have stopped pretending. Alessandro, she said, and her voice had something in it he had never heard before. Not from her, not directed at him. His phone rang. The federal contact, urgent. He looked at the phone. He looked at Sophia. You have to take it, she said. He did. The conversation was 11 minutes long and required his full attention. When it ended, he put the phone down and turned to say the thing that had been waiting. Sophia was standing with her coat on. It's almost 11, she said. I'm going home. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back, just her face. One more look. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth. She left. Alessandro sat in the empty office. He thought about what she hadn't said. He thought about the fact that she'd listened to everything, taken it all in, absorbed it completely, and hadn't run from it, and hadn't given him an answer, and hadn't told him it was impossible. She had said thank you for the truth. He turned that over in his mind for a long time. A woman like Sophia Bennett, who had spent 3 years watching him from the chair to the left of his desk, who knew which version of his silence meant danger, and which meant thinking, and which meant grief, that woman, hearing what he'd just told her, had chosen to say thank you instead of no. That wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a refusal. And Alessandro Romano, who had spent 20 years learning to read the informations that mattered in the spaces between what people said, understood that the difference between those two things was the only thing he needed to think about tonight. He turned off the desk lamp. He sat in the dark for a moment. Then he stood, put on his coat, and went home. She said thank you for the truth. Alessandro had turned that over in his mind for 3 days. Not obsessively, he wasn't built for obsession, had trained himself out of circular thinking in his early 20s, because circular thinking got people killed in his world. But the way you turn over a stone you've found in an unexpected place, examining it for what it is, what it means, whether it belongs to something larger. Thank you for the truth. Not, I feel the same way. Not, this changes things. Not, I need time. Just a clean, direct acknowledgement, the kind Sophia gave to everything real, the same tone she used when he made a decision she thought was right and said so without ceremony. She had treated his confession the way she treated good information. She'd taken it in, filed it, acted on it by leaving, which was its own kind of answer. He didn't push. He was many things, some of them not good, some of them complicated, most of them deliberate, but he had never once in his life pushed Sophia Bennett toward anything she hadn't already decided to walk toward herself. That instinct had served him for 3 years. He was not about to abandon it now that the stakes had become personal. So he waited. And on the 4th morning, she walked into his office at 8:15 with 2 coffees and her leather portfolio and sat down in the chair to the left of his desk, and she said, Carter's program director is back in the Bronx. Maricela went back yesterday. The staff has been briefed on security protocols your team installed. Everything is running. Good, the federal investigator Reeves wants to meet with you. That stopped him. He looked up from the document he'd been reading. Reeves wants to meet with me. He called Carter. Carter called me. She held his gaze steadily. Reeves knows you were involved in the Soren situation. He doesn't know the specifics. He wants to understand the landscape. His words, according to Carter, were, and I'm quoting exactly, "I want to sit across from Romano and understand what he knows and what he's willing to do about it." Alessandro sat back. A federal investigator wanting to sit across from Alessandro Romano was not, on its face, a comfortable proposition. Federal investigators who wanted to sit across from him generally wanted one of three things: information, cooperation, or leverage. The question was always which one they led with and which ones they were holding in reserve. Carter vouched for you, Sophia said. That's why Reeves reached out through him rather than formally. Carter vouched for me, Alessandro repeated. He did. He looked at her. Something moved through his chest that wasn't quite irony and wasn't quite gratitude, a complicated feeling with no clean name. 4 days ago, he had been jealous of Daniel Carter. Now Daniel Carter was vouching for him to a federal investigator in a case that could dismantle Victor Soren's network from the inside out. The world, Alessandro thought, had a particular sense of humor. When, he said. He suggested tomorrow, neutral location. Carter's office. Carter's office isn't neutral. Then where? Alessandro thought for exactly 4 seconds. Here, my conference room. If Reeves wants to understand the landscape, he can do it on the ground I choose. That's the first thing he needs to understand about how I operate. Sophia made a note. I'll arrange it. She looked up. Is there anything you want me to be in that meeting for? He looked at her. She looked back, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes asking the real question, not can I be there, but do you want me there? The difference mattered, and she knew he knew the difference. Yes, he said. She nodded and wrote something else in her portfolio. Sophia. He said it before he had a clear plan for what followed. She looked up again the other night. He stopped. I want to make sure I didn't make things uncomfortable. Between us, in a way that affects, you didn't, she said. Simply, directly, no hedging, no reassurance performance, just the flat truth delivered the way she delivered everything that was flat and true. All right, he said, but Alessandro, she held his gaze a moment longer. Don't do it again until you have something more complete to say. What you told me the other night was honest. I appreciated it. But honest and complete are two different things, and I'm not good with half-open doors. He absorbed that. Understood, he said. She went back to her portfolio. He went back to his document. The office was quiet and entirely normal, and completely different from what it had been a week ago, and both of them knew it, and neither of them made it a problem, and that, Alessandro thought, was a specific and rare kind of grace. Reeves arrived at 10 the next morning. He was 52, compact, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had been doing this long enough that it gave away nothing by default. He shook Alessandro's hand without ceremony, declined coffee, and sat down at the conference table with the careful economy of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where every movement is being read. He looked at Sophia briefly when she took her seat. Ms. Bennett, he said, Daniel Carter speaks highly of you. Daniel is generous, Sophia said, with the exact right amount of warmth, enough to be human, not enough to give Reeves anything to use. Reeves looked at Alessandro. I appreciate you meeting with me. I'm curious what you think I know, Alessandro said. That's usually more interesting than what I actually know. Reeves almost smiled. Carter tells me you moved quickly when his people were threatened. Before he could have formally requested help, before law enforcement was involved in any visible capacity. I have resources. I'm aware of your resources. Reeves said it without inflection, not accusatory, not deferential, just acknowledging a fact they were both going to be adults about. What I'm trying to understand is why you used them in this particular direction. Soren was threatening people who don't deserve to be threatened. Soren has threatened people before without you getting involved. Those situations didn't come to my attention in a way that required a response. And this one did. This one did, Alessandro confirmed. Reeves looked at him steadily. I've been building a case against Victor Soren's financial infrastructure for 14 months. Carter's cooperation has been valuable. What I need, and what I can't build from Carter's side of things, is a picture of how Soren's network operates at the level above the community contracting. The structural level, the people who aren't visible in the community but whose money is. He paused. You know that level. The room was quiet. Alessandro looked at Reeves for a long moment. He was running calculations that weren't simple about exposure, about what cooperation meant versus what it cost, about the specific and non-negotiable lines that existed in his world between information that could be shared and information that could not, about loyalty, about his own history, about the fact that Victor Soren was not a man Alessandro was loyal to, had never been, would never be, but that what Reeves was asking still lived in territory that required careful navigation. I can tell you structural things, Alessandro said finally. I cannot give you names of individuals. I will not give you documentation that touches my operations or my people. What I can give you is an architectural understanding of how Soren's network moves money through community development, contracting the mechanism. Not the names, the mechanism. Reeves looked at him. The mechanism could be enough. That's what I thought. Why are you willing to do this? Alessandro considered the question. Not the careful political version, but the real one. Why, actually, was he sitting across from a federal investigator offering cooperation that he had spent 20 years refusing to offer anyone? He thought about Maricela Torres being followed home in the dark. He thought about Carter's logistics coordinator, 26 years old, in debt to people who had offered him the only exit that seemed available. He thought about what Victor Soren's infrastructure actually did to the neighborhoods it occupied, not as an abstraction, not as strategy, but as a thing that happened to real people in real buildings, on real streets. He thought about Sophia, in her chair to his left, who looked at what Daniel Carter was building and saw something real. He thought about the person he had been at 26, standing at a dinner table in a world he hadn't chosen and choosing the only path that seemed available, and who he'd spent 15 years becoming on top of that beginning. Because some things should end, Alessandro said. And I'm in a position to help this one end, and I've spent a long time using my position carefully. I'm choosing to use it differently in this situation. Reeves was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Alessandro gave him the architecture. The layering of shell companies through community development block grants. The specific mechanisms by which legitimate contracting bids were manipulated. The financial relationship between Soren's network and 3 specific property management entities. None of it with names, all of it with the structural specificity of a man who had spent 20 years understanding exactly how money moved through shadows. When it was over, Reeves gathered his notes he'd written by hand. Alessandro noticed, no recording device in evidence, which was its own kind of statement about how Reeves operated and stood. This is useful, Reeves said. I expect Carter's people will continue to be left alone. That was already the case. But yes, Reeves looked at him. You're not what I expected, Mr. Romano. I've been hearing that this week, Alessandro said. It's not a small thing, I know. Reeves left. Sophia waited until his footsteps were gone from the hallway before she turned to Alessandro. You gave him enough to finish the case. I gave him the structure. His team will do the rest. You didn't have to. He looked at her. I know. She held his gaze for one beat longer than professionally necessary. Then she picked up her portfolio and stood. I'm going to call Carter. He'll want to know it went forward. Tell him, I said. Tell him the work is worth protecting. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, that layered thing, the one he'd stopped trying to name, and started simply watching for, the way you watch for weather. I'll tell him exactly that. She walked out. He sat in the conference room alone for a while. He thought about the person he'd been 10 days ago, standing at a charity gala, watching another man make Sophia laugh, and the specific, shameful smallness of what he'd done about it, the manufactured interruption, the territorial maneuver, the instinct to control a situation that wasn't his to control. He thought about who he wanted to be, not who he had been. Who he wanted to be, it was, he acknowledged, not a question he'd asked himself in a long time. The answer came from an unexpected direction, as answers often did. It was a Thursday, 6 days after the Reeves meeting, and Alessandro was in the middle of a call with his Chicago office when Tom knocked and said, Bennett needs you. She says it's personal. The word personal made Alessandro end the call faster than he'd ended any call in recent memory. He found Sofia in her office, not at her desk, but standing near the window, her phone in her hand, and her face doing something he'd never seen it do before. Not professional composure, not the careful managed expression she wore when things were difficult, and she'd decided to manage them. This was something underneath all of that, something younger and less defended, and the sight of it put a cold, specific alertness in Alessandro's chest. "What happened?" he said. She looked up. She'd been crying, not currently, but recently, in the past few minutes, the kind of crying that leaves evidence on a face that normally shows very little. "My sister called," she said. "Her husband Marcus, not your Marcus, he lost his job. They have 2 kids, their house." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Started again. "They're 3 months behind on the mortgage. They're going to lose it by the end of February." If she stopped again. Alessandro waited. "I've been sending money when I can," she said. "For about 8 months. I didn't mention it because it's not—" She made a small, contained gesture. "I can cover the back payments. I have savings. But the ongoing situation won't resolve unless Marcus finds work, and he's been trying," and she looked at the phone in her hand. "I just needed a minute." Alessandro crossed the office in 4 steps. He didn't touch her. He sat in the chair, across from hers, the visitor's chair, the one clients used, the chair that said, "I'm on your side of the desk," not behind it, and he said, "Tell me about him." "Marcus, what does he do?" She looked at him. "What?" "Your brother-in-law. What's his field?" She blinked. "He was in operations management, logistics for a mid-size manufacturing company in New Jersey. The company downsized. He's been applying for 8 months. Experience level, 12 years. He's good at it."
She stopped. "Alessandro, you don't have to—"
"I know I don't have to." He held her gaze with the steady, direct attention that he'd spent his life using to make difficult things manageable. "Tell me," she told him. The specifics: 12 years in operations, a specialization in supply chain coordination, 2 specific manufacturing processes he'd optimized at his previous company. She talked about her sister's kids, a boy 7 and a girl 4, and the way she'd been trying to keep the situation from becoming visible in Sofia's work life for 8 months and hadn't managed it today. Alessandro listened completely. He did not interrupt. He did not strategize out loud. He listened until she finished. Then he said, "I have 3 manufacturing partners in the metro area. One in New Jersey, Castellano Industrial, in Parsippany. They've been looking for an operations director since October. The position hasn't been publicly listed because they're being selective about the candidate profile." He paused. "I can make a call him. Alessandro Mino. I know what you're going to say. I don't want him to get a job because of me. He would get the job because he's qualified, and the position matches his experience. I would make the introduction. That's how most people who get jobs in competitive markets get them, through introduction. The introduction doesn't change his qualifications. It changes the probability that his qualifications get seen." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering access. There's a difference." She was quiet. "The mortgage," he continued, "is a separate conversation. I'm not—" He chose the next words carefully because this mattered and he didn't want to say it wrong. "I'm not offering to solve that for you. That's yours. But if you want someone to talk through the financial mechanics, I have people who can help you do it efficiently." Sofia looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were still slightly red at the edges. He held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't fill the silence with anything that would make his offer more palatable or his presence more comfortable, because he'd learned a long time ago that some moments required you to just be in them without flinching. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not the way she'd asked it about Carter, not probing his motivations. She was asking something more direct than that, almost asking, "Why are you the kind of person who does this?" "Because you're sitting in that chair, with your eyes red," he said, "and I have the ability to make one of the things that put you there easier. And I would be paused. I would be the wrong kind of person if I sat here and didn't offer it." Sofia looked at him. He watched her make a decision. He couldn't see exactly what the decision was. She was better at keeping her internal processes private than anyone he knew, but the moment of it was visible, the slight change in her posture, the breath she took. "Okay," she said. "The introduction, yes." He picked up his phone and called Gino Castellano directly. The call lasted 6 minutes. Gino said, "Send me the resume by tomorrow. If it's what you say, we'll have him in for a conversation next week." Alessandro gave Sofia's brother-in-law's name. He ended the call. He looked at Sofia. "Send me the resume tonight," he said. "I'll pass it to Gino directly." She nodded. She had both hands wrapped around the coffee cup on her desk, that specific gesture, both hands, that he'd cataloged without knowing he was cataloging it, and she was looking at him with that expression again. The layered one. "You told me the other night," she said slowly, "that you know which laugh is real." He waited. "What else do you know?" she said. It was a genuine question. Not rhetorical, not seductive, just real, the way Sophia's questions always were, direct and without decoration, asking for the actual answer. He thought about what to say. He thought about the fact that she'd told him not to open half-open doors. He thought about the fact that this question was an invitation toward completeness, and that she was asking it in the specific aftermath of a moment in which he had chosen to be the right kind of person rather than the careful kind. "I know you hold your coffee with both hands when you're thinking through something that matters," he said. "I know you only use my first name when what you're saying is more important than the professional distance. I know you have a real laugh and a professional laugh, and I have counted the times in 3 years I've heard the real one." He paused. "I know that when you're angry you get quieter, not louder. I know you've been sending money to your sister for 8 months and telling no one, because you decide it was your responsibility and not a burden to distribute. I know Alessandro," she said it quietly, "just his name." He stopped. She looked at him across the desk in the afternoon light, with the red still faintly at the edges of her eyes, and her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and said, "I know things about you too." He was very still. "I know you read the financial reports before 6 in the morning, because you don't sleep well, but you won't tell anyone that. I know you speak to your grandmother's memory in a language you don't use publicly. I know the reason you built the company in legitimate sectors after your father's generation, not because you had to, but because you chose to, and you've never told anyone that was a choice." She paused. "I know that when you walked across the room at the gala and interrupted my conversation with Daniel Carter, you looked more frightened than I've ever seen you look in 3 years. And I've seen you in some genuinely frightening situations." The office was very quiet. "I looked frightened," he said. "To me," she said, "only to me, because I've learned how to read you." Another pause. "And I think that's significant, that you're readable to me at all." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I told you I'm not good with half-open doors," she said. "You did. I need you to understand something." She set her coffee cup down. Her hands were steady. "I am not a person who makes this kind of decision quickly or easily. I'm not someone who crosses lines she's drawn without being very certain about why she's crossing them. I work for you, that's real. The complexity of that is real." "I know," he said. "I'm not finished." She held his gaze. "I also am not going to sit here and pretend that the last 10 days haven't shown me a version of you that I didn't entirely expect." She paused. "I expected competence. I expected intelligence. I didn't expect Maricella's brother-in-law. The way you talked to Carter, the things you gave Reeves." She paused again. "I didn't expect you to sit in the chair on my side of the desk." Alessandro was quiet. "What are you saying?" he asked. He asked it plainly, directly, the way she asked him things, because she'd spent the last 3 years showing him that directness was more efficient than performance. "I'm saying I need time," she said, "not endless time. Not I'm not closing a door. I'm saying I need to think clearly about something that matters. And I can't think clearly about it while I'm in the middle of it." "All right, that's it? All right, Sofia." He looked at her with the full, unfiltered attention that he'd been rationing for 3 years. "I have spent 15 years learning to be patient in situations where patience was the difference between outcomes. I can give you time." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere." She absorbed that. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she picked up her phone and said, "I'll send you the resume tonight." He nodded and stood. He was at her office door when she said, "Alessandro." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting on my side of the desk." He left her office and walked back to his own, and he did not look back, because he had learned that there was a particular kind of moment that required you to trust it and walk forward, and this was one of them. He was in his office at 8:30 that night when Marcus called. "We have a problem," Marcus said, Alessandro straightened. What? Soren didn't back down, he escalated. Marcus's voice had the specific flatness it took on when the information was serious and he was being careful with delivery. There's a man been in our network for about 4 months. Junior position, logistics coordination. His name is Pavel Orlov. He's been feeding Soren information about our arrangement with Carter. Not operational details, the protection arrangement, specifically. Soren knows Carter is under our umbrella, and he's made a calculation. He's going to move against Carter in a way that forces my hand, Alessandro said. If I respond, I create exposure. If I don't respond, Carter's people are unprotected, and Soren demonstrates that my protection is conditional. Yes, when? We think within 48 hours. Possibly less. There's movement in Soren's network tonight that suggests he's accelerating. Alessandro was already moving standing, retrieving his jacket, reaching for the second phone. Where is Orlov now? Handled as of 30 minutes ago. He's contained, not harmed. He gave us the timeline voluntarily once he understood his options. And Carter? Carter is at his apartment, unaware. Alessandro pulled up Sophia's number. Then he stood with his phone in his hand and thought about what he was doing. He thought about the conversation an hour ago, Sophia saying, "I need time to think clearly," and what it would mean to call her into another crisis situation the same evening she'd asked for space. He put the phone down. He picked up a different one. Called Carter directly. "Carter," he said when the man answered. "Don't go home tonight. Right now, wherever you are, stay there. I'll explain in 20 minutes. Carter was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Understood," he said, without argument, without questions, without performance. The same directness he'd shown from the beginning. Alessandro called Marcus back. "Get to Carter's location." "I'm coming to you." He was at the door when his phone rang. Sophia's name. He stopped, he answered. "Tom told me you left the building fast," she said. "What's happening?" He thought about lying. Then he remembered that he'd decided to stop doing that in the specific small ways that had accumulated into something larger. Soren escalated, he said. "Carter is being moved." "I'm handling it." A pause. "Where?" she said. "Sophia might." "Alessandro, where?" he told her. She was already there when he arrived, standing outside Carter's building with her coat buttoned and her phone in her hand. And the specific expression on her face of a person who has made a decision about what kind of moment this is and acted on it without second-guessing. He looked at her. "You asked for time to think," he said. "You should be home. I think better when I'm useful," she said. "And you need someone who knows Carter's staff and can coordinate information quickly." She held his gaze. "Don't make this about the other thing right now. What do you need?" He looked at her for one moment. He chose. "I need you to get Carter's program director on the phone," he said. "Maricela. She needs to know there's a situation, and she needs to stay at the secondary location your team designated for her last week." Sophia already had the phone to her ear. He moved past her into the building. The next 3 hours were the specific, contained kind of emergency that Alessandro had navigated enough times to know had its own rhythm, not chaos, not calm. But the space between those two things where clear thinking and fast movement were both required, simultaneously. Carter was relocated without incident. 2 of Soren's men who appeared near the building were dealt with by Alessandro's security team with a precision that required no escalation. The federal investigator Reeves was notified through the appropriate channel that Soren had made an active move, which accelerated a timeline in the federal case that Alessandro hadn't been told about specifically but could infer. By midnight it was over. Carter was secured. His people were secured. Soren had made a move and found the resistance overwhelming and the cost of continuing too high. The federal case was accelerating on its own momentum now, and Soren Alessandro's contacts, confirmed by 11:45, was beginning to understand that the ground he'd been standing on was not as solid as he'd believed. Alessandro stood outside the building. Sophia stood beside him. The night was cold. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Not completely, not until the federal case lands." "No," Alessandro agreed, "but he's going to be careful for a while." "And careful is enough for now." She turned to look at him. "Are you all right?" He looked at her. The question was so simple and so direct and so characteristically her. The way she moved straight to the real thing, without the surrounding architecture of what people usually asked when they were asking that question, that it landed somewhere undefended. "Yes," he said, "Alessandro, I'm telling you the truth. I know, I'm asking," but she stopped. She turned slightly away, looking at the street, and her jaw worked for a moment the way it did when she was choosing words carefully. "Because this started," she said, "with you throwing a glass at a charity gala. And now we're standing on a sidewalk at midnight, having navigated a federal situation and a criminal escalation." And she stopped again. "It's been 10 days, yes, a lot has happened in 10 days. Yes," she turned back to him. "I said I needed time to think clearly." His chest went very still. "I've been thinking," she said. "Clearly or not, I've been thinking." Her voice was level, completely controlled, but her eyes had that quality he'd started to recognize, the one he'd never named, the one that meant she was letting him see something real. "What did you decide?" he said. She looked at him for a long, specific moment. And then she said, "That I'm also not going anywhere." The street was quiet. He looked at her, she looked at him. And Alessandro Romano, who had held himself together in federal investigations and criminal escalations and the death of his father and 15 years of a world that punished vulnerability without mercy, felt something unlock in his chest that he hadn't known was locked. "Sophia," he said. "I know," she said. And for one moment, standing on a cold sidewalk at midnight, with the city around them and everything still complicated and nothing resolved, and the future entirely unclear, they simply looked at each other with the full attention of two people who have stopped pretending. It was not a beginning, but it was the moment before one. And Alessandro, who had spent 15 years understanding that the moment before something matters as much as the thing itself, understood that this was enough. For now, it was more than enough. "I'm also not going anywhere." Those 5 words lived in Alessandro's chest for the next 72 hours, like something warm and dangerous, at the same time the way anything valuable feels when you've spent years believing you don't deserve to hold it. He didn't act on them immediately. That surprised people who knew him, the ones who understood that Alessandro Romano, when he decided something, moved. He didn't deliberate after deciding. He didn't reconsider. He acted with the clean, direct efficiency of a man who had learned early that hesitation cost more than mistakes. But this was different. Sophia had said she wasn't going anywhere. She had not said come closer. And Alessandro had spent enough time understanding her, really understanding her, the architecture of how she thought, the specific precision with which she used language, to know that those two statements were not the same thing. She had opened a door. She had not told him to walk through it. She was waiting, he understood, to see whether he knew the difference. He did, so he waited, he worked, he managed his empire with the same disciplined attention it had always required. He sat across the desk from Sophia every morning and went through the operational details of his business life and treated her with the same professional respect and reliance that had characterized 3 years of working together. But something had changed that neither of them mentioned directly. She stayed later. Not visibly, not in a way that anyone in the office would have noticed or been able to name. But Alessandro noticed, had always noticed, had simply now stopped pretending he didn't, that the time between when her work was technically finished and when she actually left had been growing. Small increments, 20 minutes one evening, half an hour the next. Not doing additional work exactly, moving slower. Being present in the way that a person is present when they are comfortable somewhere and not in a hurry to leave. He noticed. He said nothing. On the 4th day after the sidewalk, she came into his office at 6:15 in the evening, an hour after Tom had gone home. An hour after the building had gone to its after-hours quiet, and she set a folder on his desk and said, "The Mercer Contract Amendment. They accepted our counter. I need your signature on 3 pages." He signed them. She picked up the folder. She didn't leave. He looked up. She was standing on the other side of his desk with the folder in her hands and an expression that was not professional and was not the carefully managed personal she'd been showing him all week. It was something more direct than either. "Ask me something," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "Ask me something you've wanted to ask for 3 years and haven't." She held his gaze. "I'm giving you one. No professional calculation, no careful framing. Just ask it." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he actually wanted to know. Not what he was supposed to want to know, not what was safe or strategic or appropriate. What he actually genuinely had carried for 3 years and never asked. "Were you ever afraid of me?" he said. She absorbed that. He could see her absorbing it, the slight shift, the processing. "No," she said, "not of you." She paused. "Of the situation sometimes. Of what working for you required me to be sometimes." "Not of you. Why not?" "That's 2 questions, Sophia." She looked at him for a moment. "Because I looked at you the first week, and I saw a man who was working very hard to be frightening." Her voice was level, honest, without cruelty. "And people who are working hard at something are not the thing they're performing. They're the person underneath the performance. And the person underneath, I was never afraid of him." Alessandro sat with that. "What were you afraid of?" she asked. "About me." Specifically, he looked at her. "That you'd leave," he said. "Not quit, not professionally. Just that you'd reach a point where who I was and what my life was would become something you couldn't be near. And that I would have let you become necessary before I understood that was possible." The office was very quiet. Sophia set the folder on the edge of his desk. She sat down, not in her professional chair, the one to the left, but in the chair directly across from him. The one clients used, the chair on his side of the desk, where he'd sat in her office when she'd been crying. She sat there and looked at him and said, "I have wanted to ask you something for a year and a half." "Ask it." "The afternoon you found out about the Brennan situation, when your Chicago operation got hit and you lost $3 million and 2 contracts, and the man responsible was someone you'd trusted for 6 years. She paused. "I came to give you the debrief. You were standing at the window. And when you turned around, you looked—" She stopped. "You looked like a person, not a boss, not the Romano organization. A person who was hurt, I remember," he said. "You saw that I noticed. And then you rebuilt the expression in about 4 seconds and went back to being the version I was supposed to see." She held his gaze. "Why? Why then? You'd shown me real things before. Why did that one require the mask?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't about the money," he said. "It wasn't about the contracts. It was about—" He stopped. He was choosing something here, between the version he'd been giving for 15 years and the version that was actually true. His name was Frank Caruso. I'd known him since I was 19. He was at my father's funeral, I thought. He stopped again. "I thought he was someone who chose me, not my name. Not my organization, me, and he hadn't." He'd chosen the calculation. A pause. "That kind of betrayal doesn't belong in a debrief. So I put it somewhere it couldn't affect the analysis." Sophia looked at him. "Where do you put things?" she asked quietly. "When you put them somewhere." He thought about the honest answer. "Here," he said, and he meant the office. He meant the work. He meant the 15-year structure he had built around himself that was efficient and powerful and almost airtight. "I put them here, in the work, and I let the work carry them until they're small enough not to matter." "Does that work?" "It used to," he said. She understood what that meant. He could see her understanding it. "Since when?" she asked. "Since about 3 years ago," he said, "give or take." Sophia held his gaze for a long, specific moment. Then she said, "I'm going to say something difficult. All right, the thing between us, whatever it is, whatever it becomes, cannot happen inside the structure it's currently in." She said it without apology, directly, the way she said everything that mattered. "I cannot be your assistant and the person you're vulnerable with. Not because I don't want both, but because one will always compromise the other. And I won't do that to either of us." The words landed with the specific weight of a true thing. Alessandro didn't flinch from them. He'd known this was coming. He'd known it the way you know a storm is coming, when you understand weather, not the exact moment, but the inevitability. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm telling you what's true. And I'm telling you because you deserve to hear it before it becomes a problem, not after." She paused. "You have time to think about what that means. So do I. And if I tell you, I've already thought about it." She looked at him carefully. "Then tell me what you concluded." He leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the desk. "I concluded that I have spent 3 years organizing my professional life around your presence because I was afraid that changing the structure would lose me both the professional and the personal. And that what I was actually doing was choosing the certainty of having you at a distance over the risk of having you at all." He paused. I don't want the structure anymore. I want the actual thing. Sophia was very still. The actual thing is complicated, she said. I know complicated, he said. Not like this, she said. You know complicated in a world where you control most of the variables. This is complicated in the world where you don't control any of them, where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, where you cannot manage it from the position you're used to standing in. She held his gaze. Can you do that? He thought about the honest answer. I don't know, he said, but I want to find out. It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years, and he felt it physically, the specific vulnerability of a true admission in a life that had been built largely on the management of what was shown and what was kept. Sophia looked at him for a long time, then she picked up the folder from the edge of the desk. I need 2 weeks, she said, to figure out the professional side. What it looks like, what changes, whether I stay in the role or whether we build something different. She stood. And Alessandro, if I decide the professional needs to change, I need you to be able to hear that without it feeling like loss. Because it won't be loss. It will be me making room for something real. I can hear it, he said. Promise me. He looked at her. I promise you. She walked to the door. Sophia, he said. She turned. For what it's worth, he said, the 3 years were worth it. Whatever comes after the 3 years were worth it. She held his gaze for one beat. Yes, she said, they were. She left. Alessandro sat at his desk in the quiet office and breathed. The call from Marcus came at 9 the next morning, and it detonated everything. Soren made a move, Marcus said, not against Carter. Against you. Alessandro was immediately, completely alert. What kind of move? He went to the press, a journalist, Sarah Wentworth, investigative New York Chronicle. He fed her documentation, or what looks like documentation. Marcus's voice was careful. It ties your resources to the Carter protection operation. It frames it as organized crime, extending its reach into community development under the cover of federal cooperation. Alessandro felt the architecture of the situation assemble itself in his mind with cold, rapid clarity. He's trying to blow up the federal case by contaminating the cooperation. Yes, and he's trying to put you in a position where defending yourself publicly damages either your operations or the case. When does the story run? Wentworth is giving you 48 hours for comment. Her editor has already seen the documentation. They're moving. Alessandro put the phone down. He sat for exactly 90 seconds, which was how long it took him to map the full landscape, the angles, the pressure points, the available responses, and their consequences. Then he stood and walked to Sophia's office. She looked up when he came in. She read his face in approximately 2 seconds. What happened? He told her, directly, completely, without softening anything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. Soren is brilliant, she said, and desperate. Those two things together are the most dangerous combination. Yes, the documentation, is it real? The facts it contains are real. The framing is fabricated. What I did with the Carter situation was the actions were real. The intention behind them is being characterized in a way that inverts their meaning. So the story isn't false, she said. It's just wrong. Yes, she absorbed that. Who's your media attorney? Rachel Voss. Call her now. Before you decide anything else. She was already reaching for her own phone. I'm going to call Carter. He needs to know this is coming. Sophia Alessandro. She looked at him with the specific, clear attention of a person who has moved into a mode that has nothing to do with confusion or fear. I know what I'm doing. Call Rachel. He called Rachel. The conversation with his media attorney was brisk, professional, and arrived at 3 possible responses: a preemptive statement, a legal challenge to publication, or silence and response after publication. Rachel laid out the costs and benefits of each without editorializing, because that was what Alessandro paid her to do. He listened. He made the decision before she finished. We go forward, he said. Not a statement, not a challenge. A full interview. Wentworth wants comment. She gets more than comment. She gets the real account. On the record. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Alessandro, an on-the-record interview about your involvement in a federal adjacent situation. Reeves knows what I did and why. Carter knows. The facts of my actions are defensible because the actions were the right ones. The only way Soren's framing survives is if I refuse to counter it directly. He paused. Set it up, today if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest. All right, Rachel said. He ended the call. Sophia appeared in his doorway. Carter's been briefed. He's furious, not at you. At Soren, he said. She paused. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell Alessandro I'll say whatever needs to be said publicly." Whatever he needs. Alessandro processed this. Daniel Carter, who had every reason to protect his own operation from the contamination of public association with Alessandro Romano, was offering to stand publicly beside him. "Tell him not yet," Alessandro said, "but tell him I heard it." She relayed it. She put her phone down and looked at him. "You're going to do the interview?" "Yes. That's either the bravest thing or the most dangerous thing you've done in this entire situation." "Probably both." She looked at him for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me figure out what I'm going to say." He sat down on the edge of his desk, not behind it, just on the edge of it, which was not a position he usually occupied. Not the legal version, not the managed version, the true version. In language that a person reads and believes because it's the actual account. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what happened," she said. "From the beginning, the real beginning. You were there." "Tell me anyway." "In order." She held his gaze. "Because the version that comes out of you when you're telling it to me is different from the version that comes out when you're constructing it for public consumption. And you need to know the difference before you walk into that interview." He looked at her. He started talking. He told it in order. The gala, the glass, the jealousy he hadn't understood yet. The file on Carter that he'd requested out of motives he'd been lying to himself about. The moment he'd read the file and understood that Carter was exactly what he appeared to be, and that his own reaction had been rooted in something small and personal. The information about Soren's surveillance, the decision to protect Carter's people, the real decision, not the strategic one, the one that came from looking at what Carter was building and understanding that it deserved protection. He talked for 40 minutes. Sophia listened. She didn't interrupt except twice, once to ask a clarifying question about the sequence of the Sorshin escalation, once to ask what he'd been thinking in the moment before he'd called Dmitri for the second time. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is the interview. It's too personal. It's the truth. Personal truth is the only kind that reads as real." She leaned forward slightly. "Alessandro, you are sitting across from a journalist in 48 hours to defend actions that were genuinely good. The only thing that makes them look otherwise is if you present them the way you present everything else from behind the architecture. From behind the control." She held his gaze. "You have to let Wentworth see the version of you that I see." He was quiet. "That's a significant thing to ask," he said. "I know. I'm asking you to trust that the real version of what happened is more powerful than the managed version." "Because it is." She paused. "And I'm asking you to trust that I know you well enough to understand what you're capable of in that room." Another pause. "Do you trust me?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. Immediately, without calculation, she absorbed that. "Then let me help you prepare," she said. They worked for 6 hours. Not drafting statements. Sophia had been right that statements were the wrong approach, and she'd been firm about it in a way that Alessandro had learned meant she was certain and he should listen. Instead, they talked through the account, over and over, from different angles. Sophia asking the questions Wentworth would ask, and Alessandro answering them with increasing directness and decreasing architecture until the account was clean and real and survivable. By 8 that evening, Alessandro was physically tired in a way he rarely was, not from the work but from the sustained effort of being honest out loud, which turned out to require more energy than managing a crisis. They ordered food. It arrived. They ate at the conference table, with the session materials spread between them. "You haven't eaten today," Sophia said, which was not a question. "I had coffee." "That's not food, Sophia," she said. Flat final, the specific tone that ended arguments. He ate. She watched him with something on her face that was private and warm, and that she didn't try to hide, and he noticed it and didn't comment on it, because some things were better held lightly. "The 2 weeks I asked for," she said, after a few minutes. He looked up. "I think circumstances have compressed the timeline somewhat," she said. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She set her fork down. "Alessandro, I've been watching you for 6 hours be the version of yourself that I've always known was underneath everything else. And I've been helping you figure out how to show that version to the world. She paused. It seems like the wrong moment to be precious about my own timing. He was quiet. What are you saying? He said. I'm saying. She stopped. She looked at him with the full, undefended attention he had seen exactly once before, on a cold sidewalk at midnight. I'm saying I want to figure out what this looks like. You and I, the real version, not the version we've been managing for 3 years. She paused. I don't know what that means for the professional structure yet. But I know that's a solvable problem, and I know that problems I want to solve feel different from problems I'm avoiding. He was very still. You want to solve this one, he said. Yes, she said. He sat with that for a moment, the specific, unprecedented feeling of having something you've wanted for a long time become possible in the middle of a crisis, which was, he thought, probably the only conditions under which it could have happened. Because the crisis had stripped away every piece of the structure that had been keeping it impossible. There's something I need to tell you, he said, before this goes any further. She waited. The professional structure, he stopped. 2 months ago, I had my attorney draft documents creating a senior partnership position. Not an assistantship, an operational partnership, with equity in 3 of the legitimate business structures, board-level decision authority, compensation that reflects what your actual contribution has been worth. He held her gaze. I drafted it because I could see where things were going, and I wanted the structure to be ready. So that if things changed between us, the professional change wouldn't look like a consequence of the personal one. It would look like what it is, something that was already true. Sophia stared at him. You drafted that 2 months ago, she said. Yes, before the gala, yes. She was quiet for a moment. He couldn't read her expression. The full complexity of it was beyond his cataloging. Alessandro, that is either the most calculated thing you've ever done or the most thoughtful. I thought it was both, he said. I'm hoping you agree. Something moved across her face, and then she laughed. The real one, the one he'd counted, the one that closed her eyes slightly at the corners and changed her whole face for one unguarded moment before she pulled it back. He watched it happen. He thought, there it is. Number 13 in 3 years. He had the rest of his life to stop counting. Show me the documents, she said when she'd recovered. Tomorrow, he said. After the interview. The interview is at 10. I know. Show up at 9. We'll go in together. She looked at him. Together. If you're comfortable with minus. Alessandro, she said, and her voice was warm in a way it had never been directed at him before, warm and certain, and his yes. Together. The interview with Sarah Wentworth ran 4 days later. It ran on the front page of the Chronicle's Sunday edition, above the fold, under the headline, The Romano Question a Mafia Boss, a Community Program, and an Unlikely Alliance. Alessandro read it at his kitchen table at 6 in the morning with coffee and a specific quiet attention. Wentworth was a good journalist. She'd taken the account he'd given her, the real account, the one Sophia had helped him arrive at, and she'd presented it with the complexity it deserved. Not a hero story, not a redemption narrative, a true account of a man who operated in a difficult world and had made, in one specific situation, a series of choices that were straightforwardly good. She'd included Carter's statement, Alessandro Romano protected my people when they were in danger. He did it without being asked, without negotiation, and without requiring anything in return. I don't know everything about his world, but I know what I saw in this situation. She'd included Maricela Torres. I was followed home in the dark by people who didn't want us to succeed. The next morning I was safe, that's what I know. She'd included Reeves, carefully, in language that acknowledged the federal cooperation without compromising the case. The information provided was material and offered in good faith. And she'd included Alessandro in the words he'd used in the interview room with Sophia beside him, not because Sophia had spoken, but because having her there had allowed him to be the version of himself that spoke clearly. He was looking at a paragraph near the end when his phone rang. Sophia's name. I'm reading it, she said when he answered. So am I. The paragraph in the middle where you talk about what Carter's programs actually do for those communities. The economic dependency analysis. A pause. That's the real you. You helped me find it. No, she said. It was already there. I just asked the right questions. A pause. How do you feel? He thought about the honest answer. Exposed, he said. And not sorry about it. She was quiet for a moment. That's new. Yes, he said. It is, Alessandro. Sophia, I spoke with Rachel yesterday afternoon, she said. About the partnership documents. She walked me through them. A pause. They're more than fair.
There another pause.
They're what the contribution has actually been worth. Not what you needed to offer to make the arrangement work. What it's actually worth. I know the difference, he said. I know you do, she said. That's why it matters. She paused once more. I'm accepting them. He set his coffee cup down. All right, he said. His voice was steady and completely calm, and everything inside him was not. Alessandro. Her voice had that warmth again, the one that was new in his. We're going to figure out the rest. Yes, he said. We are. Outside the window, the city was beginning its morning. He could hear it, the specific sound of New York deciding to be alive again for another day, indifferent and full of possibility at the same time. Come to the office by 9, he said. I'll be there at 8:30, she said. I'm always early, I know, he said. I've always known. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her smiling in it, a different kind of knowing, the best kind. See you at 8:30, she said. She ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table, with his coffee and the newspaper, and the city coming awake outside his window, and he thought about the fact that 15 years of building things had brought him, somehow, to a morning like this one, not triumphant, not resolved, not clean, but real. Real was better, real was. He understood now, the only thing that had ever actually been worth building. She arrived at 8:27. Alessandro knew because he was already at his desk, and he heard the elevator, and then her footsteps in the hall, a sound he had registered thousands of times, without acknowledging that he registered it. The specific rhythm of Sophia Bennett moving through space with the purpose and economy that characterized everything she did. She came through the door with 2 coffees and her portfolio, and she stopped when she saw him. He was standing, not working, not on the phone, not reading. Just standing beside the window in the early morning light, and he was looking at her the way he'd stopped, pretending he didn't look at her with the full, direct attention he'd spent 3 years distributing carefully across every other surface in the room. She looked back. You're early, she said. So are you. I said 8:30. You said you're always early. He crossed the room and took his coffee from her hand, their fingers close for one moment in the transfer. I believed you, she almost smiled, set her portfolio on the desk. Sat in the chair across from him, not the left chair, the professional chair, but the one directly across, the one she'd been choosing for the past week, the one that said something neither of them had needed to say out loud. The Chronicle piece, she said. My phone hasn't stopped. Mine either. Carter called at 7. He said the foundation got 4 new major donor inquiries overnight. People who read the piece and want to be associated with what he's building. She paused. He also said to tell you that he owes you a conversation. A real one, over actual food, not a conference table. Alessandro sat down. What did you tell him? I said I'd pass the message. She looked at him carefully. Do you want to have that conversation? He thought about it. A month ago, even 3 weeks ago, the question of whether Alessandro Romano wanted to have a voluntary, social conversation with Daniel Carter would have had a clear and immediate answer. Yes, he said, I think I do. Sophia's expression did that thing, the layered private thing he'd stopped trying to name and started simply receiving. Good, she said. Sophia, I know what you're going to say. Do you? You're going to say something about the partnership documents and the professional structure and make it very organized and contained, so that the other thing, the actual thing, has a clear boundary around it. She held his gaze. You're going to try to manage it. He looked at her. Old habit, he said. I know, I'm asking you not to. She leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the edge of the desk. We're both adults. We both understand what the professional change means and what it doesn't mean. We don't need to spend the next hour drawing maps. She paused. I accepted the documents. That's real. What I'm asking is, what do you actually want to say this morning? Not the organized version. He sat with that for exactly the length of one breath. I want to say that I'm glad you're here, he said. That the 8 minutes between 8:27 and 8:35 felt longer than they should have. That I read the Chronicle piece this morning, and the only thought I had after finishing it was that I wanted to tell you about it in person, not by phone. He paused. And that I have spent 15 years being certain about things, and the only thing I'm certain about right now is that I want to figure this out. With you, at whatever speed you need, on whatever terms actually work. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. That, she said quietly, is the unmanaged version. Yes, I prefer it. I'm beginning to understand that. She reached across the desk and put her hand over his briefly, just for a moment, a touch so simple and direct that it bypassed every piece of the professional architecture they'd both been maintaining and landed somewhere real. Then she picked up her portfolio and said, "We have a 9:15 with the Castellano team." Gino Castellano confirmed Marcus, my brother-in-law. Marcus starts in 2 weeks. Full operations director role. Alessandro looked at her hand, now wrapped around her portfolio, and felt the specific warmth of a moment that was both small and large simultaneously. "Good," he said. "He called me last night," she said. He was crying. Quietly, so I wouldn't hear it, but I heard it. She kept her eyes on the portfolio. "He said to tell you thank you, that he knew it wasn't nothing, what you did." It wasn't nothing, Alessandro agreed, but it also wasn't difficult. He's qualified. The introduction was the only gap. He knows that, she looked up, but he also knows why you made the call. And so do I. He held her gaze. The 9:15 arrived. They worked. The federal case against Victor Sorin broke open 6 weeks later. Alessandro read about it first in the secured briefing Marcus prepared each morning, a single paragraph, precise, confirming that Reeves's team had executed simultaneous warrants at 7 locations associated with Sorin's network. The operation had been in preparation for months. The structural information Alessandro had provided had been, according to a source Marcus wouldn't identify but whose reliability he vouched for, the piece that allowed investigators to map the financial architecture completely enough to act. Sorin was in federal custody by noon. By 2 o'clock, Alessandro's phone had received 17 calls, lawyers, journalists, rivals, associates, men in various positions across the city who wanted to understand what it meant that Victor Sorin was finished and what Alessandro Romano's role in finishing him was. He answered 4 of them. The other 13 went to voicemail. At 3 o'clock his office door opened, and Sophia came in and set a coffee on his desk and sat down and said, "How are you handling it?" He looked up. "Efficiently. That's not what I asked." He set the phone down. "I'm handling it the way I handle things." Alessandro. He looked at her. "The honest version," she said. He sat back. "I'm thinking about Pavel Orlov," he said. "The young man in my network who was feeding information to Sorin. 26 in debt, no good options visible to him." He paused. "I cleared his debt and severed his connection to Sorin's network. He doesn't know it was me. He thinks the debt was purchased and forgiven by a non-profit financial assistance program." A pause. "I've been thinking about what his life looks like now." Whether the exit was enough, Sophia was quiet for a moment. "Did you follow up?" she asked. "Indirectly. He's employed. The debt is resolved. He's not in contact with anyone connected to Sorin's network." "Then you gave him a real exit," she said. "What he does with it is his." "I know, but you're still thinking about it." "Yes." She looked at him. "That's new too." "What is?" "Thinking about individuals." She said it without judgment, simply as observation. "You used to think in structures, organizations, mechanisms." She paused. "Now you're thinking about a 26-year-old you've never met and whether a clean exit was enough for him." He looked at her. "You did that," he said. She shook her head. "I didn't do anything. I just asked the right questions." "The thinking was already in you." "Sofa, I mean it." She held his gaze with the specific certainty she used when she was saying something she'd considered thoroughly. "You have been, for 15 years, a more careful person than the story your reputation tells. I saw it the first week. The way you actually make decisions, the things you won't do, the lines you've always held, even when no one was watching. That didn't come from me." She paused. "But maybe having someone who sees it helped you stop hiding it." He was quiet. The afternoon light was thin through the window. The city made its perpetual noise below. Everything in the room was exactly as it always was, and entirely different from how it had been 2 months ago, and Alessandro Romano sat in the difference and felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that this specific, complicated, unmanageable, real thing was the thing he had been building toward without knowing it for 15 years. "I want to show you something," he said. He opened the desk drawer and took out a folder, not the partnership documents. Those had been signed and filed 2 weeks ago. A different folder, older. He slid it across the desk. She opened it. It was a development proposal. Community investment in 3 South Bronx neighborhoods, not charitable, not performative, but substantive. Economic development infrastructure, business lending, property investment that would displace the gap Soren's network had been filling with something that actually benefited the people in those communities. She read it in silence for 4 minutes. He waited. "When did you draft this?" she asked. "The first version was 3 weeks ago," he said. "I've been revising it. You want to move capital into the communities Carter's programs work in. I want to build something that lasts longer than a protection arrangement," he said. Soren is finished. The structural dependency he was maintaining doesn't disappear when he does, it just looks for the next available source. I want to put something legitimate in the space before someone else fills it the wrong way. Sophia looked at the proposal for another long moment. "This is a 10-year project minimum," she said. "Yes. The returns won't be significant for 4 or 5 years." "I know, Alessandro." She looked up. "This is the most fundamentally different thing you've done with your capital in 15 years. "Yes," he said. "Why now?" He looked at her directly. "Because I finally understand the difference between protecting what I've built and building something worth protecting." Sophia held his gaze for a long, specific moment. Then she looked back down at the proposal and said, "The community lending structure in Section 3 needs to be restructured. The way it's currently designed, the interest rate caps will make it financially unviable within 2 years. I can fix it." He looked at her. "You want to work on it," he said. "I want to make it work," she said. "There's a difference." She looked up. "That's what a partner does." He let the words sit between them. Partner. The professional version and the personal version and every version between all of them present in the way she said it, clear-eyed and direct, the way Sophia Bennett said everything that was both true and important. "Then fix Section 3, he said. She opened her portfolio and started writing. He watched her for a moment, the speed of her thinking, visible in the pen moving across the page, the slight furrow between her brows when she was solving something, and he thought about the specific, unlikely chain of events that had started with a broken glass at a charity gala and arrived here. He thought about jealousy, the original thing, the small, shameful, unmanaged thing he'd felt, watching Sophia laugh at another man's words across a crowded room. He'd been so certain in that moment that he was losing something, that another man's presence in her attention meant subtraction from his own. He understood now what he'd actually been feeling. Not loss, fear, the specific clarifying fear of a person who has been standing at the edge of something real for a long time and has just understood for the first time, with full clarity, exactly how much it would cost to fall. And what he'd done with that fear, for the first time in his life, was not control it. He'd let it show him where to go. 3 months after the Chronicle piece ran, Daniel Carter called Alessandro directly. Not through Sophia, not through Marcus, his own number which Alessandro had given him at the end of the Soren situation, and not expected Carter to use casually. "I'm doing a community event next month," Carter said. "In the Bronx. Maricela is organizing it. It's a celebration. The program hit its 1,000 placement mark last week." A pause. "I'd like you to come, not on the stage, not as a public figure. Just there." Alessandro was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. "Because the people there should know that the reason they still have this program running is more complicated than they might assume," Carter said. "And because I think you should see what it looks like when something you protected actually grows." Alessandro thought about it. "All right," he said. He told Sophia that evening. She was quiet for a moment. "He invited you." "Yes." "Are you going to go?" "Yes." She looked at him. "You know it'll be visible. People will see you there." I know what it'll do to the narrative," Alessandro said. "I've thought about it." He paused. "I've decided I don't care." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's new," she said. "Most things are new lately," he said. She almost smiled. "I'm coming with you." "I know," he said. "I didn't plan to suggest otherwise." The event was on a Saturday afternoon, and Alessandro arrived without security visible, which had required a significant conversation with Marcus, who had ultimately deferred with the specific, contained expression of a man who has registered his objection for the record and accepted the decision. Sophia arrived with him, not as his assistant, not with her portfolio or her professional armor. In a coat he hadn't seen before, unhurried, beside him on the sidewalk outside the community center, in a way that was simply natural. The word kept arriving for things that were new between them. Natural, real, the words that had been absent for 15 years now showing up everywhere. Inside, the room was full. Maricela Torres was at the front, talking to a group of young men and women who had come through the program, people with jobs now, with stability, with the specific upright posture of people who have been given an exit and taken it. Carter was moving through the room the way he always moved without theater, with direct attention, stopping fully for each conversation. He saw Alessandro come in. He crossed the room. He extended his hand and Alessandro shook it, and Carter said, "Thank you for coming." And Alessandro said, "Thank you for building something worth coming to." And it was simple and true and required nothing else. Carter looked at Sophia. "You look different outside the office." "Most people do," she said. "You both do," Carter said, looking between them with the quiet perceptiveness Alessandro had initially found irritating and had come to recognize as simply Carter, seeing clearly, the way Carter always saw clearly. Good different. He didn't say anything else about it. Just nodded once and went back to his room. Alessandro stood with Sophia and watched the room. Maricela Torres found him 20 minutes later. She was 43, small, with the kind of face that had seen significant difficulty and had not been made bitter by it, had been made precise instead, attentive. The face of someone who had learned to read situations quickly and act on what she read. She stopped in front of him. "You're Romano," she said. "Yes." She looked at him without flinching. "I was followed home," she said. "Two men at night." She paused. "The next morning they were gone. My building had security I didn't arrange, and nobody told me why." "I know," he said. "Was that you?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. The kind of moment that doesn't have a comfortable social script, two people from entirely different positions in the world, standing in the same room, looking at the same thing directly. "Why?" she said. "Because what you're doing here matters," he said. "And because no one should be followed home in the dark for doing something that matters." Maricela looked at him. She nodded once. It was not a small nod, it was the specific nod of a person who has assessed something carefully and arrived at a conclusion. Then she said, "There's food in the back, you should eat something," and she walked away. Sophia, beside him, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the best review you've ever received." He looked at her. "There's food in the back," he said. She laughed. The real one, full and unguarded and warm, the one he'd stopped counting, because it wasn't rare anymore, because he'd finally understood that the rarity had never been about her. It had been about the distance he'd maintained, and the distance was gone. He stood in a community center in the South Bronx on a Saturday afternoon with the sound of Sophia's real laugh and a room full of people who had needed an exit and found one, and he thought about the broken glass at the Metropolitan Pavilion Gala, and the file he'd requested at 7 in the morning, and the moment he'd decided to protect Daniel Carter's people, not because it was strategic, but because it was right. He thought about the cost of that chain of events. Not the professional cost, those calculations had been made and settled. The personal cost, the specific unprecedented cost of allowing himself to be seen. By Reeves, by Carter, by Wentworth and the readers of the Chronicle. By Maricela Torres, standing in front of him and asking why with the directness of someone who deserves a straight answer. By Sophia, most of all, he thought about what it had felt like to be seen and not to manage it. Real, he thought. It had felt real. And real he understood now, with the clarity of a man who had spent 41 years building walls and 10 weeks choosing not to. Stand behind them. Real was the only thing that had ever, in the end, been worth anything at all. 6 months after the gala, Alessandro Romano made the first public investment under the new Community Development Initiative in the South Bronx. The announcement ran in the business section, not the front page. He'd been specific about that, with the PR firm Sophia had selected. Not a story about him, a story about the investment. The Carter Community Initiative was listed as an operational partner. Sophia Bennett was listed as managing director of the Romano Community Investment Group, a role that had been built from the inside out over 4 months of restructuring, of careful professional architecture, of the specific and deliberate work of two intelligent people deciding how to build something real out of something that had started as something else. She had an office on a different floor now, her own team. her own operational authority across a portfolio that was substantive enough that she spent roughly half her professional week entirely independent of Alessandro's immediate sphere. The first week of that arrangement, he'd found the building oddly quiet. He'd called her twice in one morning for things he could have emailed. She'd answered both times, handled both situations in under 4 minutes each, and then said, on the second call, "Alessandro, you're calling because it's quiet." He'd been quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Come down for lunch," she said. He did. They had lunch in her office, her side of the desk. His side of the desk, the distinction already dissolved into something simpler and less architectural, and she walked him through the Section 3 revision she'd finalized. The community lending structure that now worked, the 5-year projection that made the 10-year project viable. He listened the way she'd always listened to him fully, without performing attention, with the real thing. "This is going to work," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him across the desk. "You're not quiet anymore." He considered this. No. What changed? He thought about the honest answer. "I stopped waiting for something to be taken away," he said. "When you expect loss, you hold everything at distance. Because if it's already at distance when it goes, the going is survivable." He paused. "I don't want survivable anymore. I want real." Sophia looked at him with that expression, the fully open one, the one he'd worked for without knowing he was working for it for 3 years, and she said, "Real is harder." "I know. Real means I tell you when something isn't working. Including between us. I know. Real means I'm not managing you and you're not managing me." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "I'm asking for it anyway." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Alessandro Romano asking for something he can't control." Her voice had warmth in it, the specific warmth that was only ever directed at him, and that he had spent 3 years pretending not to notice. "That's the story, right there. It's a better story than the one I had before," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She picked up her pen and looked back at the projection on her desk. "Now stop being emotionally significant, and tell me whether you think the Year 3 revenue model is too conservative." He almost smiled. He leaned forward and looked at the numbers. "It's too conservative," he said. "I thought so too," she said. They worked. The city moved outside the window. The building held its ordinary noise around them. And Alessandro Romano, who had walked into a charity gala 2 months ago as a man who had never lost control, never shown fear, never allowed anything past the architecture he'd spent his life constructing, sat across a desk from the woman who had dismantled that architecture, not by force, but by simply being real in the presence of it, year after year, until he'd had to choose between the wall and what was on the other side. He had chosen. He was still choosing. That, he understood now, was what it meant to love someone the right way, not the single dramatic decision, not the managed revelation, not the controlled fall from a carefully calculated height, but the ongoing daily deliberate choice to stay undefended, to be seen, to let the real thing be real. He looked at Sophia, her pen moving, her brow slightly furrowed, entirely absorbed in the numbers in front of her, and he thought, "This is what I was afraid to lose." Not an assistant, not a professional resource, not the most competent person in his orbit. This the specific, irreplaceable, impossible to manage reality of her. And he had not lost it. He had, for the first time in his life, stopped holding it at distance and found that it was still there. Better than still there, growing, real. Alessandro Romano had spent 15 years building an empire on the certainty that he could control what mattered most, and it took one broken glass, one real laugh, one woman who refused to be impressed by any of it, to show him that the only thing worth having was the thing you were brave enough to stop controlling and simply finally choose.